A very warm welcome to everybody from wherever in the world you may be joining us tonight. This is the second lecture in the Judge Wendell Griffen lecture series presented by the two faculties of the University of Pretoria, the Faculty of Theology and Religion and the Faculty of Law. In this series, we explore the pandemic in its different manifestations. This second lecture will focus on the pandemic and morality exposed, religious and legal perspectives. I would also like to welcome all the speakers and the panelists who will present tonight, and we will introduce them as we go along. First up, I would like to go to Professor Jerry Pillay, the Dean of the Faculty of Theology and Religion, to introduce our main speaker tonight, Judge Wendell Griffen. Over to you, Professor Pillay.
Thank you, Professor Schoeman. I join with Professor Schoeman in greeting and welcoming everybody to this platform. Good day, good evening, good morning, depending where you are. We are really glad that you are joining with us in this second lecture, and we look forward to this evening's proceedings as we listen to Judge Griffen. But may I please just allow a few minutes to introduce him as he prepares to speak. Judge Wendell Griffen is pastor of the New Millennium Church in Little Rock, Arkansas. He's a CEO and owner of Griffen Strategic Consulting, PLLC, and circuit judge for the 6th Judicial District of Arkansas in the 5th Division. His consulting practice is based in Little Rock and provides strategic advice and assistance to clients concerning cultural competence and inclusion and diversity. Griffen grew up near Delight and attended racially segregated public schools until 1965, before graduating with honors from Delight High School in 1968. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and was a distinguished military graduate from the University of Arkansas in 1973. He also earned a law degree from the University of Arkansas School of Law in 1979 and was an associate editor of the Arkansas Law Review. Between college and law school, he served in the United States Army, attaining the rank of First Lieutenant before his honorable discharge from the U.S. Army in 1976. Griffen headed the Race Relations Equal Opportunity Office for the 43rd General Support Group at Fort Carson, Colorado, and was awarded the Army Commendation Medal for that service. After law school, Griffen represented clients in business and taught litigation for 15 years as the first associate and partner of color to join a major Arkansas law firm, with the Little Rock law firm of Wright, Lindsay, and Jennings. He also served as chairperson of the Arkansas Workers' Compensation Commission for almost 2 years after being appointed to that post by former Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. He served as a judge on the Arkansas Court of Appeals from January 1, 1996 through to December 31st, 2008. And he also taught administrative law, constitutional law, criminal procedure, and a seminar on law and cultural competence as a visiting professor of law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, William H. Ballard School of Law. And that was in January from 2009 to May 2010. He was elected Circuit Court Judge for the 5th Division of the 6th Judicial District in November 2010, and has presided over civil and criminal cases since January 2011. Griffen is married to Dr. Patricia Griffen, who is a clinical psychologist practicing in a private practice in Little Rock. They are both blessed with two adult sons. Griffen is a trustee of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. He is the author of The Fierce Urgency of Prophetic Hope and 2 internet blogs, Wendell Griffen on cultural competency and Justice is a Verb. And he frequently lectures and writes about legal ethics and professionalism, religion and social justice, and public policy. Now, the last time when we had our first lecture, Professor Alan Busak was the one who introduced Judge Griffen. And in his very eloquent style, he said to us what was not in the CV. And I thought that was most impressive. So what is not in the CV? Just a quick summary from my side. Well, I've known Judge Griffen for a relatively short time, since we've been trying to put this particular lecture project together in collaboration with the Faculty of Law. And somehow, even though I've met him just very recently, and that too only virtually, I feel like I've known him for such a long time. I am deeply struck by his compassion and his passion for justice, truth, moral values, and ethical leadership. And whenever you hear him speak, you can hear the prophetic voice, but you can also hear the passionate voice in terms of belief and the need to do that which is right. So as a theologian and pastor and judge, he is ideally gifted and most suitable to present this lecture to us today on the topic, the pandemic and morality exposed, legal and moral perspectives. So it is my joy and privilege, without further ado, to invite him to deliver this second lecture. Thank you, Judge Griffen.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Pillay. And good day to one and all. Dean Schumann, Professor Busak, Professor Malaki. I want to, first of all, thank Dean Pillay and Dean Schumann for inviting me to deliver these lectures, and thank them for the courtesies of their colleague and Dr. Busak in their collaboration on these lectures. In my first lecture, Vaccination or Not, Legal and Religious Perspectives, I analyzed the issue of vaccine hesitancy and legal and religious issues surrounding vaccination mandates related to the SARS-19 coronavirus and its pandemic. I said in that lecture that vaccine hesitancy is not affected by whether governments have the power to mandate vaccinations. Also, vaccine hesitancy related to the SARS-19 coronavirus is not driven by whether and how personal liberty, including religious concerns, of unvaccinated persons are accommodated. Rather, opposition to COVID-19 vaccine mandates, in the US at least, is based on moral incompetence. Politicians are deliberately weaponizing that moral incompetence to advance their personal political ambitions. Those politicians know that vaccine mandates are lawful. After all, they are people in states that have long mandated vaccinations to prevent infection and spread of communicable diseases. I mentioned biblical passages from Isaiah, Micah, and the Gospel of Matthew, and I cited the views of Professor Alan Busak to basically condemn that unprincipled political opposition to COVID-19 vaccination mandates. 3 months have passed now since that first lecture. COVID-19 has been around now for 2 years, having first appeared in December 2019 in Wuhan, China. The global death toll from that coronavirus continues to rise. Even though safe and effective vaccines have been developed, produced, and are most available in the United States and other affluent nations of the world, the highest rate of new COVID-19 cases has occurred in those societies. The death toll from COVID-19 in the United States as of September 20, 2021, when I delivered my first lecture, had reached 675,000. At that time, it was higher than the death toll from the 1918 influenza pandemic. 2 months later, on November 21, 2021, the death toll in the US had reached 770,000. Public health experts project that the probable death toll from COVID-19 in the US by the end of next week, by November 11, 2021, will be between 788 and 798,000 persons. The death toll from COVID-19 in the United States, a society that boasts of its robust economy, its scientific experts, and public health infrastructure, is the highest in the world. An article released by the Associated Press on November 20 of this year reports that the Russia Coronavirus Task Force reported 263,000 COVID-19 deaths, by far the highest in Europe. The article states that some experts believe that the death toll in Russia from coronavirus-related causes is actually much higher than that, with data suggesting that the death toll between April of 2020 and September 2021 was 462,000 persons. Johns Hopkins University publishes case and death counts data for most countries in the world, with North Korea being a notable exception, in that it claims to have had no COVID-19 cases or death. An article in the Guardian newspaper on November 21 of this year reported that the COVID-19 death toll was over 612,000 in Brazil. It was over 465,000 in India, over 292,000 in Mexico, 201,000 in Peru. In the United Kingdom, the death toll had exceeded 143,000. In France, the death toll stood at 116,000. In each of these societies, the death toll from COVID-19 was higher than that of South Africa, where at the time, 90,000 persons had been recorded to have died due to COVID-19. And so, the rising COVID-19 death toll in the United States and other affluent societies in the face of widespread, safe, and effective vaccines for the SARS coronavirus is grim proof about the moral incompetence and the self-serving political calculations that were mentioned in my earlier lecture. Each of the deaths is a tragedy. However, the global death toll is a travesty. Meanwhile, political leaders across the world continue to pander to anti-vaccination constituencies by opposing vaccine mandates and governmental efforts to prevent spreading the SARS-19 coronavirus through mass mandates and restrictions on public gatherings. In the United States, private employers opposed to the vaccine mandate issued by the Biden administration based on a federal law governing workplace safety and health convinced judges on one of the more conservative courts of appeal of our federal government to declare the mandate unconstitutional. And it's at this time, more than half of the US states' attorneys generals have filed legal challenges to the vaccine mandates in 5 appellate courts. In September 2021, the Supreme Court of the United States invalidated a nationwide eviction moratorium issued by the Centers for Disease Control of the US Department of Health and Human Services that was intended to prevent transmission of the SARS-19 coronavirus among people and families living in rented residential housing. Across the world, COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation persists. A November 25, 2021 article in The Guardian reported about false claims that were being circulated online that Aboriginal people from Binjari and Rockhold in Australia's Northern Territory were being forcibly removed from their homes and taken to enforced quarantine in Howard Springs, and that people, including children, were being forcibly violated. Those claims were declared false by the Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance Northern Territory, AMSANT, the local Aboriginal Health Services unit, and false by community leaders. On May 20, 2021, the Wall Street Journal International magazine published an article by Boris Cizelji, a political scientist, economist, and former diplomat whose knowledge economy network, KEN, tries to coordinate global networks around the goal of what he calls a more sustainable future for world community. The following observation by Cizelji illustrates the scope and depth of the moral and ethical issues exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Quoting Cizelji, "The pandemic has arrived when the world was facing a most complex set of challenges, crises, accumulating over a long time. The virus has flooded on the surface, already simmering with long neglected problems, lack of attention to public health and elderly care, facing an exacerbating environmental crisis, tolerating huge inequities, practically ignoring migration and refugees crisis, and facing as a consequence numerous humanitarian crises, technological and productivity showdown, erosion of democracy, digital disinformation and erosion of privacy, economic nationalization, globalization backlash, protectionism, trade wars, accompanied by tectonic changes in the world power structure. While the pandemic can be contained through vaccination, bringing us back to normal, many of the above mentioned long-term problems are of a different nature and cannot be fixed without radical changes in the world order in line with principles of sustainability." Cizelji adds, "These crises should thus not be regarded only as an economic or social phenomenon, or now as a health issue, but as a very complex multidisciplinary problem and challenge. Hyperglobalization has clearly catapulted the political economy trilemma, trade-offs between sovereignty, globalization, and democracy, while we are facing the inability to deal with all three at the same time. Therefore, reconstructing the global economy in a post-pandemic world cannot rely on old formulas or totally free trade concepts or economic nationalism, but should look for more mature and sustainable political economy responses," end quote. As I read that comment, I was reminded immediately of another comment by Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1964. Quoting King now, "I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say, "This is not just." It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say, "This is not just." The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. End quote. The COVID-19 pandemic shows that the revolution of values that King urged and the more mature and sustainable political economy responses that Boris Johnson called for have not occurred. If anything, the pandemic made the inequities mentioned by King, a Black Baptist pastor born in Atlanta, Georgia during the Jim Crow era, and Sejelji, a white political economist with professional and academic ties to neoliberal capitalism, even more obvious and oppressive. The right-wing politicians, self-described evangelical Christian conservative preachers, political pundits, and free market capitalists who complain about COVID-19 vaccination mandates in the United States, Brazil, the United Kingdom, Europe, Australia, and elsewhere know that compliance with the mandates reduces transmission of the SARS-19 coronavirus. They know that unvaccinated people run increased risk of becoming infected. And the makers of COVID vaccines know they have not made vaccines available to less affluent societies in Africa, Asia, South and Central America, and to indigenous and communities of color in North America on a fair basis. They know that flooding affluent societies with booster shots, while impoverished societies and communities do not have ready access to the first round of vaccines, will widen healthcare disparities that already torment people, with disproportionately adverse consequences to indigenous persons in Africa, Asia, the Americas, Australia, and Palestine. Again, the behavior of these political, religious, and commercial actors is not innocent. It is not inadvertent. It is not careless, thoughtless, or even reckless. It is tempting to agree with Pope Francis, who warned years ago about what he termed a globalization of indifference based on an economy of exclusion. However, the social and economic inequities that pre-existed the COVID-19 pandemic are being worsened by deliberate behavior that is not indifferent. It is ruthless. As I mentioned in my earlier lecture, this conduct is diabolical. However, it is important to discern how that diabolical conduct is operationalized. As a jurist, I am concerned about the morality of legal responses to the pandemic. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. served on the Supreme Court of the United States for 29 years, from 1902 to 1932, longer than anyone else in the court's history. In 1881, before he joined the Supreme Court, Holmes made the following observation while delivering lectures on the common law in Great Britain, quoting Holmes: "The life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience, the felt necessities of the time, the prevalent moral and political theories, the intuitions of public policy, avowed or unconscious. Even the prejudices which judges share with their fellow men have had a good deal more to do than the syllogism in determining the rules by which men should be governed. The law embodies the story of a nation's development through many centuries, and it cannot be dealt with as if it contained only the axioms and corollaries of a book of mathematics. In order to know what it is, we must know what it has been and what it tends to become. We must ultimately consult history and existing theories of legislation. But the most difficult labor will be to understand the combination of the two into new products at every stage. The substance of the law at any given time pretty nearly corresponds, as far as it goes, with what is then understood to be convenient, but its form and machinery and the degree to which it is able to work out desired very much upon its past." End quote. The conventional view is that judges are less prone than legislators, governors, and presidents to be influenced by prevailing views and public opinion when making decisions. The often quoted statement by Holmes should cause people to question the accuracy of that conventional view. Law schools do not routinely graduate students who question the morality of market economics and capitalism. After graduation, new lawyers typically begin their careers with firms and government offices doing work to support existing systems, even if they are oppressive, not dismantle them. Within the legal profession, conformity is not merely convenient. It is professionally and economically rewarding. Conformity is a prerequisite for advancement. Likewise, theology schools are not typically considered places that nurture nonconformity, let alone welcome it. Divinity school graduates who do not conform to conventional perspectives about religion and ethics seldom become local congregational leaders, denominational leaders, or successful religious educators. It is important to remember that reality when one analyzes the morality of legal and religious responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Legal and religious institutions usually produce results based on prevailing attitudes, values, and behaviors in a society, including attitudes, values, and behaviors that reinforce inequities and disparities. Thus, law cases involving landowners and tenants have resulted in decisions where landowners and landlords are favored over tenants. Witnessed the U.S. Supreme Court decision in September that struck down the CDC eviction moratorium. Cases involving manufacturers, including those who manufacture prescription drugs, typically result in decisions favorable to manufacturers and unfavorable to consumers, including patients. Employers are favored over workers. Wealthy interests are typically favored over the interests of impoverished, indigenous, and other people of color. And that was true before the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and it is still true. The ruthless pandemic conduct that has worsened pre-existing inequities will continue because that ruthlessness is a frontal attack on the idea that each person owes a duty of compassion and care for every other person. But once enough people reject that sense of duty, the health and security of the whole world is jeopardized. Examples of that ruthlessness abound. One recalls the decision by former US President Donald Trump in April 2020 to suspend US support to the World Health Organization, the WHO. The United States provided $553 million, $500 million to support the WHO in 2019, and was the largest national donor. In making the announcement, Trump accused the WHO of severely mismanaging and covering up the dangers and origin of the coronavirus infection. That accusation was a despicable and dangerous lie. The WHO warned the US and other nations as early as mid-January 2020 about the risk of human-to-human infection from coronavirus. On January 30, it officially declared a public health emergency of international concern. Trump presented no evidence whatsoever that the WHO could or should have taken those steps sooner. Moreover, when the WHO issued that notification in technical guidance notes, Trump paid no attention. On February 27, 2020, a month after the WHO published an official report that warned of human-to-human transmissibility of coronavirus and that transmissibility would be higher than seasonal influenza, Trump downplayed the threat against the advice of US health and intelligence experts. Halting funding for the WHO was Trump's ploy to shift blame for the COVID-19 death toll in the US from his vicious incompetence and to scapegoat a multinational organization associated with the United Nations, a body he and his white nationalist base had long despised. What made the ploy so dangerous and despicable was that people were dying in the US and throughout the world. from COVID-19 infection. Americans were not dying because of anything the WHO did or failed to do. They were dying because of what Trump did and failed to do. In this sense, the cruel suspension of US support to the WHO was not only fraudulent, it was a crime against humanity. Trump minimized the coronavirus threat. He insisted that coronavirus was no more dangerous than seasonal influenza, even after health and scientific experts declared that it was exponentially more lethal than seasonal flu. He delayed declaring a national emergency out of concern about the effect on wealthy investors in the stock market if he did so. Trump lied about how many people were being tested. He lied about the availability of testing. The Trump administration refused for weeks to use validated WHO protocols for coronavirus testing, and then the administration promulgated an invalid coronavirus test that had to be scrapped. None of these things was the fault of the WHO. In that sense, Trump's decision to suspend benefits to US support to WHO recalls a line spoken by Tyrion Lannister regarding his nephew, King Joffrey Lannister, in the award-winning HBO Game of Thrones series. Quote, "We've had vicious kings and we've had idiot kings, but I don't know if we've ever been cursed with a vicious idiot for a king," end quote. Furthermore, Trump's sociopathic idiocy has been imitated by national leaders elsewhere. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro downplayed the threat of COVID-19, touted misinformation and unproven treatments, and, like Trump, ignored international health guidelines on mask use and public activity. Now, Brazil has the second highest COVID-19 death toll behind the US in the world, with more than 600,000 persons lost, as Bolsonaro faces the possibility of charges of corruption and crimes against humanity. In India, where the COVID-19 death toll now exceeds 465,000, COVID-19 misinformation via the internet from religious leaders and even from some sectors of government has occurred. Thanks to misinformation from governmental leaders such as Trump in the US and Bolsonaro in Brazil, misinformation and disinformation spread online, and the ruthless diversion of COVID-19 resources from public health purposes into the pockets of private profiteers, the dangers that Martin Luther King Jr. warned about in April 1967, racism, materialism, and militarism, which have been deliberately, actively, and openly sacralized by evangelical religious congregations for the past half century, have been normalized across the United States and spread throughout the world. In a tragic sense, the chickens of racism, materialism, and militarism have come home to roost with the COVID-19 pandemic. Roosting chickens eventually hatch their eggs. Free market fundamentalists, religious nationalists, and proponents of what former US President Dwight Eisenhower famously called the military-industrial complex have elected politicians in the US and elsewhere who proudly question the need to protect public health, who cut vital social services, including access to health care, nutrition assistance, housing, and public education for people who are needy, and who question the need to protect people from bigotry and discrimination. Martin Luther King Jr. warned in 1967 that a nation which spends more every year on war making than on programs of social uplift does so at a peril that King then called a tragic death wish. We are now seeing that tragic death wish play out in homes, neighborhoods, and communities across the US and the wider world, thanks to the cancerous effects of free market fundamentalism, religious national conservatism, white supremacy and patriarchy, and social media disseminated xenophobia, coupled with the crass materialism of the misnamed prosperity gospel. We are cursed, and our curse includes willful amnesia and deliberate disregard by religious leaders about the moral incompetence, the vicious idiocy, and the shameless dishonesty of political leaders. That willful amnesia and deliberate disregard for truth and justice, which define public religious discourse and influenced public policy in the United States for generations, now threatens the world. I hope when future generations examine the words and actions of this period, they will discern the relationship between the moral, religious, and social perspectives of people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Mike Huckabee, Billy Graham, and Franklin Graham, and the racist, materialist, and militarist policies that resulted in US voters electing a vicious idiot who suspended aid to the World Health Organization during a deadly global pandemic. I hope future generations will condemn religious people in our time. Yes, condemn the pastors and educators and denominational leaders and congregations who embraced those perspectives and policies and supported local, state, and federal politicians who governed by them. I hope they will not give thanks for those religionists and politicians and the suffering that occurred because of our curse. Instead, I hope they will denounce the multi-generational moral, ethical, religious, economic, social, and political hell they inherit as a legacy from our era. Perhaps then something akin to repentance will happen. Then future generations will repent and pay for deliverance from the curse we have placed on them. God will have mercy on them then. Until then, our curse will continue as it should. However troubling our situation appears to be and is, people who believe in love and justice should not throw up our hands in despair. After all, there's nothing new about greed, self-centeredness, and other harms associated with injustice. The inequities exposed and worsened by the pandemic are deeply rooted in existing legal and religious systems and practices. But something else is also rooted. That something else is the unflinching and unrelenting moral and ethical prophetic imperative to speak the truth about injustice, dismantle systems of injustice, and develop, construct, and support just systems of health, public safety, and social well-being. This unflinching and unrelenting moral and ethical prophetic imperative inspired the work and lives of prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, John the Baptist, and Jesus in the Bible, but it also inspired people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, James Cone, and Katie Cannon in the United States. It inspired Albert Luthuli and Steve Biko and Winnie Mandela and Alan Buzak and Tanyiko Madueke and other champions of liberation and justice in South Africa. That moral and ethical prophetic imperative is active during every age and can be found in every society, but it requires people with enough discernment to recognize threats to justice. It requires people with enough courage to meet those threats. It requires people with sufficient insight and perseverance and skill to battle the threats. And the moral and ethical prophetic imperative requires that people have enough compassion and humility to recognize that the goal is liberation and setting up just community. It is not destruction and oblivion of those with whom we disagree. The aim is not to reform existing systems that produce injustice. Rather, our goal must be to dismantle those systems and replace them with processes and policies that produce justice. In doing so, we should remember that people develop policies, people implement procedures, And remember what Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said about experience being the lifeblood of the law. We will not dismantle existing oppressive policies and procedures by relying on people who have devoted themselves to constructing, reinforcing, and advocating the systems that are producing the oppressive and unjust policies and procedures. Finally, we should recognize that the people who critique and dismantle oppressive systems may not be the same people who should be created and staffing their replacements. We need to remember the insights Dr. Alan Buzak shared in Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Waters in this regard. At chapter 2, Dr. Buzak calls for prophetic people to not be afraid to speak a different language concerning what he and Pope Francis have termed the globalization of indifference. Buzak joins Pope Francis in calling on prophetic people to not be afraid to speak a different language about human suffering. In these words, quote, "We are in no position to offer comfort, compassion, and justice to a suffering, bleeding humanity overwhelmed by a petrifying indifference. If we do not believe that there is good news they should hear, and we cannot speak a language of hope and resilience, of resistance and redemption, if we do not unlearn the language of imperial compliance, of domination and subjugation, of carelessness and indifference, of diplomatic evasion. We are no longer in a position," Buzak added, "to deny that the Pope is right. Something is wrong, and it is more wrong today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. The time has come for us not to be afraid to say it. I am not talking about merely mentioning, enumerating, or bemoaning the wrongs we see. To not be afraid to say it has everything to do with how we say it. Do we say it with truth, with courage, with compassion, and with faithfulness to those who suffer? The wrongs we see are not just happening, they are caused to happen, and they are happening to the vast majority of God's children who are vulnerable, targeted, and excluded from human consideration. They are not happening randomly, they are deeply systemic, deliberately built into systems of oppression, domination, and dehumanization. And we must not be afraid to say it." Buzak adds, "We must not only break the silence, we must speak a different language. Our language must be a courageous, liberating, transformative, healing, inclusive language. We should learn to resist the temptation to see the global realities through the eyes of the powerful and privileged, but rather through the eyes of the suffering, the weak and the vulnerable, the dehumanized and the demonized, the outcasts and the excluded. We must be much more alert in our awareness that our global reality is an imperial reality. Empires not only create realities of dominations and subjugation, they also create myths of invincibility, endless power, infinite duration, great beneficence, and divine incarnation. Crucial to all these is what Walter Wink called the myth of redemptive violence. Instead of acknowledging the violence it uses because it is needed for continued domination, subjugation, and exploitation, the empire enshrines the belief that violence saves, that war makes peace, that might makes right. Consequently, violence is not only necessary, it is the only thing that works. Close quote. I agree with Professor Buzak that prophetic people must stop being afraid to speak the language of anger, courage, and audacious hope. This is the language of Matthew 23, that dares to condemn the idolatry of empire. This is the language of Jesus, John the Baptist, and the other Hebrew prophets. This is the language of Martin Luther King Jr., Clarence Jordan, Jeremiah Wright, James Cone, Marion Wright Edelman. This is the language of the gospel. This is the language that must be heard and heeded by people who seek answers from prophetic people in our divisive time. When we are not afraid to speak this language, we will be vilified and persecuted. When we are not afraid to speak this language, those who define religious effectiveness by attendance, buildings, and cash, the ABCs of religion, will leave us. But then we'll speak like Jesus. We will sound like Jesus. We will be heard as Jesus was heard. And the redeeming results of our witness will endure long after our words and our voices have passed from memory. Martin Luther King Jr. never lost his prophetic discernment and zeal because he was never willing to substitute the vocation of politician for his calling as a prophet and pastor. Politics is fundamentally the business of compromise and bargain making. Oppressed people, however, are not well served by politicians who lack the toughness needed to reject offers to compromise about fairness. For oppressed people, questions of fairness are matters of life and death. Despite the moral and ethical issues exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, we should not lose heart. Each generation and every society must grapple with issues of justice, peace, and liberation, even without the extraordinary challenges presented by a global pandemic. What each society and generation needs are people of sufficient moral and ethical discernment, courage, perseverance, skill, and experience to manage power responsibly, meaning with justice for all. We who believe in justice must now find, develop, promote, and deploy those people so that they will be competent to deal with the global pandemic, endless wars, climate change, racial and gender-based injustice, wealth disparities, and a legion of other issues. If existing schools of law, religion, and theology are not nurturing places for people to embrace King's radical revolution of values, we must create them. We must recruit faculty and students to them. In doing so, we'll have to be disciplined and intentionally reject calls to reform or remodel the systems, policies, and practices that perpetuate and promulgate the injustice that is killing and threatening people around the world. This hard yet necessary work is ours to do. The future of the world depends on whether we have the anger and the courage to do it. Thank you for giving me this hearing.
Thank you very much, Judge Griffen, for a very informative lecture as always, and also placing in perspective the very stark reality in which we find ourselves, also calling all of us to account. As you've indicated in your lecture, there were already existing inequalities, social and economic inequalities, and we should have expected those to be exacerbated by the pandemic. But maybe what we were not expecting was the crisis of morality. And increasingly, as you pointed out, we now see this tension between law and morality and religion. And the recent identification, should I say, of the Omicron virus in South Africa, of course, has put all of that in the spotlight, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that during the question and answer session. But I think, of course, this is a very opportune time to have this lecture. We could never have imagined that we would have a new variant. You know, when we asked you to deliver this lecture and prepare this lecture for us. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights. And I'm sure that there will be many questions that people want to ask, and also certain aspects that they would like to clarify. So thank you very much again, Judge Griffen. We really appreciate the effort and the energy that go into your lectures, and I'm sure that everybody thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. I would also like to remind our online audience that they are most welcome to post their questions in the chat as we go along. We will pick up all those questions during the question and answer session. Thank you very much, Judge Griffen, again. I'm now going to turn to our first respondent. Professor Charles Maimela is the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Law, and at a very young age, he has already done a lot of research. I think most pertinent to tonight's discussion is also his research on the link, the intersection between law and religion. It gives me great pleasure, and it is an honor to now introduce to you Professor Charles Maimela to present his thoughts on Judge Griffen's lecture. Over to you, Professor Maimela.
Thank you very much, Professor Skuman. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, dumelang. Just to maybe set the tone for this afternoon's response to the main lecture by Judge Griffen, is important maybe to just bring the South African context into perspective from a legal point of view, that from a South African legal point of view, when we tackle the aspect of vaccination, there's no general law that governs the aspect of vaccination. And thus we're in the position where we say vaccination is voluntary rather than mandatory, as already alluded in the main lecture by Judge Griffen, that in some states in the US, vaccination is mandatory. In the South African context, some of the hurdles to maneuver around or making vaccination voluntary it emanates with fundamental rights that are provided and protected by the Constitution. Among others is the right to cultural and religious perspectives, which are squarely protected under Section 30 and 31 of the Constitution, respectively. Sections 10 and 11 of the Constitution, which speaks about human dignity and life. But it is important, ladies and gentlemen, to note that these rights in the South African Constitution are not absolute, and hence we saw the President on Sunday, the 28th of November, making a pronouncement that there will be a task team that will be set with the whole aim of interrogating as to whether to make vaccinations mandatory or not in the South African jurisprudence. And furthermore, one would say they will argue it in the context of Section 36, which is the general limitation clause that affirms that all the provisions in the Constitution are not absolute. And then the question which one would say that since all these rights are not absolute, does it mean that one can be forced to be vaccinated in South Africa in future? And I would say it depends on the facts of each case and the circumstances of each case. And we have seen in the South African jurisdiction that some universities have really pronounced that there will be mandatory vaccinations for the 2022 academic year. We wait to see the aspect of implementation to that effect. But the main question to this lecture today, as well as to the South African government in particular, will SA law reform be reformed due to COVID-19 challenges, among other things? So this is a question of fact which we need to grapple with as legal scholars and universities in particular. But Dean Skuman, as I now enter into what I have been called to do this evening, to just give a brief synopsis and a response to the lecture given by Judge Griffen, I would be extrapolating some points in the address which he has given to give a form of my response, with the whole aim of ensuring that we engage in this particular lecture, and also, most importantly, bring in context to the South African jurisdiction, and most importantly, to the African jurisdiction. I quote Judge Griffen. Judge Griffen speaks about the aspect that the pandemic itself exposes a number of inequalities. And I quote, he's saying, while the pandemic can be contained through vaccination and bringing us back to normal, many of the above-mentioned long-term problems are of different nature and cannot be fixed without radical changes in the world order in line with the principles of sustainability. In my response, I start with a question. Why are there still travel bans and restrictions? Is this not a contradiction from the West in the context of South Africa and Africa in particular? Furthermore, Judge Griffen makes reference or quotes Martin Luther Jr. In his address, where I will quote that while righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say this is not just. I furthermore probe and ask, is this not the position with these recent travel bans against South Africa and countries in the African region? Furthermore, Judge Griffen quotes King saying that the Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. Close quote. I further argue that this is the case because South Africa is being punished for playing a proactive role in detecting the Omicron variant. Is the Western questioning the intellectual and capabilities of South Africa and regional scientists? Is the West affirming its position and dominance in the African continent? And what is the African continent's response in crafting its only solution and path in the middle of a pandemic? Is Africa waiting for their Messiah to be able to address this situation? I regard this similar to the story of David and Goliath in the battlefield, because it is clear that the world is divided and not united in the fight against this pandemic. And hence the recent decision by the Western countries and to adversely affect the economies and lives of people in Africa. And this, without a doubt, is an arbitrary decision without a just reason. I furthermore continue with my probe and response, Professor Schoeman, where Judge Griffen, I quote, probes that employers are favored over workers. Wealthy interests are typically favored over the interests of impoverished, indigenous, and other people of color. That was true before the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and it is still true. I bring it home in the African continent, and in particular in South Africa, and I ask, are vaccines mandates not bringing the old position in the South African context of master and slave law, which is now known as labor law? As much as vaccines are necessary to save lives, vaccines should not be forced down on people and violate some of their basic rights, like the right to human dignity, equality, freedom, and religion. But rather, vaccines, awareness, and education must be accelerated to deal with this pandemic and in preparation for future pandemics. Who benefits from making vaccines mandatory? Is it employers or employees in the workplace? Is it people in general or the government? What is the role of world leaders? Is making vaccination mandatory shifting responsibility from world leaders who happen to be divided and making people on the ground to be forced? Is this not the narrative of two elephants fighting and the ground suffers, which happens to be the people on the ground? I continue, ladies and gentlemen, in my response to this evening's lecture, where Judge Griffen quotes the famous movie, The Game of Thrones series, where it is quoted, we've had vicious kings and we've had idiot kings, but I don't know if we've ever been cursed with a vicious idiot for a king. In my view, is this not the reality with the Western nations, with the recent ban on South Africa and countries in the region? I further call this an act to destroy unity and all efforts in the fight against COVID-19. I argue that this stance by the West speaks to the principle of no good deed goes unpunished in the context of South Africa and dedicated scientists in the fight against COVID-19. Professor Jonathan Johnson, an academic and former Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Free State, in his recent articles in Times Live, he calls what the West has done in restricting South Africa and African region countries as a racist act. And I fully endorse that view because there is no justification. I continue to probe Professor Busak in my response, the lecture given by Judge Griffen, where Judge Griffen furthermore states, in a tragic sense, the chickens of racism, materialism, and militarism have come home to roost with the COVID-19 pandemic. I argue that awareness and education about vaccinations broadly will save lives in the short, medium, and long term. Scientists around the world argue that COVID-19 is one pandemic which the world is facing currently, and in future other pandemics will arise. Mandatory vaccinations, I argue with respect, is a short and temporary measure to save lives indeed, but to also cover up for the lack of political will on the part of leaders of the world, and hence the on goals being scored by the West on the African continent. I further probe, ladies and gentlemen, in my response to Judge Griffen's lecture, where I quote, that the inequalities exposed and worsened by the pandemic are deeply rooted in existing legal and religious systems and practices. In my view, I argue that churches as civil society organizations have a role to play. However, they are also experiencing a pandemic of their own. There's corruption, greed, abuse of women and children, among other things, in churches, and we have seen it in the South African context. The church is no longer a safe space, and hence today, the house of the Lord is regarded as a gambling place and needs a Messiah to come clean up. And society, without a shadow of a doubt, cannot live without a church. And this calls for dedicated men and women who are driven by justice to play a role in saving the church. Furthermore, I continue to probe in my response, where Judge Griffen quotes Professor Alan Busak, where Professor Alan Busak makes a call to the world for a different language to be used. And in my response to that call is, it is time for South Africa to speak a different language, to be bold, truthful, and fighting for justice against the West in its fight for COVID-19. It is time for Africa to be bold and invest in basic values of health education in schools, universities, workplaces, and broader communities. Make local people the drivers of that education and awareness. Deal with stigma surrounding vaccines for this pandemic and future pandemics. Just like the children of Israel who were captives and slaves in Egypt, and they escaped from their captivity, they arrived in the wilderness. However, God guided them through by a pillar of a cloud to the promised land. The same can be said with the COVID-19 pandemic, that the future and solutions of South Africa and Africa lies in the hands of the people, and they must craft their own solutions to their own problems. The world has something to learn from Africa and vice versa, but not that Africa is the only one that is supposed to learn from the world in order to be better and develop. This is an unfortunate narrative, and South Africa and Africa have a duty to come up with a strategy to save lives of people, not in the short term, but also in the longer term. Africa needs to rise, and this pandemic calls for its rise. Before I conclude, Judge Griffen further quotes Martin Luther King Jr., where he states, Martin Luther outlines that never lost his prophetic discernment and zeal because he was never willing to substitute the vocation of politician for his calling as a prophet and a pastor. Politics is fundamentally the business of compromise and bargain making. Oppressed people are not well served by the politicians who lack the toughness needed to reject offers to compromise about fairness. For oppressed people, questions of fairness are matters of life and death. And in my response to that, I ask, does mandatory vaccinations not taking away this freedom from the vulnerable? People do not vaccinate, I argue, because they are not empowered. And to punish people because they are not vaccinated will perpetuate the social ills, among other things. Education and empowerment by local and health workers is a start. And just like it was done during the HIV and AIDS pandemic, lessons can be drawn from this experience. The media has a role to play in ensuring that the gospel of vaccinations reaches the four corners of the world and must shy away from propaganda reports, among other things which we have seen. In conclusion, I think South Africa and Africa broadly, as seen recently, must be bold and unapologetic to the West and work towards collaboration first within the continent. As much as the socioeconomic challenges and suffering, it might be the case of David of today and the Western world, the Goliath. But with Christ, anything is possible, and it can be the torchbearer of the world, and should not strive to win or be the Goliath of tomorrow, that is Africa, but must inspire hope, confidence, the spirit of Ubuntu, and solidarity in the fight against the pandemic. The future pandemics, equality and freedom, and economic freedom and empowerment must be the priority of Africa. It is time for Africa to claim its place on the dinner table and stop serving the master, which is the West, but to remember that there is only one master, which is the Almighty. In the South African continent, other people will also speak of the ancestors, among others, and must be sure that the master, which is the Almighty, has arrived to take them to their promised land. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Maimela, for that critical reflection on the lecture and maybe a play on the words of retired Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke. We are our own liberators, indeed. I would now like to give Professor Alan Bussack an opportunity to respond as well. Just very briefly, Professor Alan Bussack is a world-renowned liberation theologian. He's also an award-winning author, and I think he's written more than 23 books. But the one that was also mentioned in Judge Griffen's lecture, Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Waters, is one of his most recent books. Professor Bussack is currently a professor of Black theology and ethics at Pretoria University, and again, a very, very appropriate and well-informed person to deliver this response to the lecture by Judge Griffen. Over to you, Professor Bussack. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Skuman, and thank you, Judge Griffen. Thank you, Professor Maimela, for your response. I gladly will add my voice to the solid thoughts that you have brought forward. Judge Wendell Griffen writes a blog, he writes an article for some or other publication just about every week. I read them all. He sits on the bench, he hears cases every week. Every week he prepares a sermon to which I listen as my wife and I worship virtually with New Millennium Baptist Church. What astonishes me is the pace at which all this happens, the freshness of every piece of work, the hard work behind it, the unwavering clarity of truthful witness. I do not know how he does it, but here we have it again in this exceptional lecture. So thank you sincerely, Judge Griffen, for what you have offered us today. 2 years ago, as the pandemic hit humanity, the World Communion of Reformed Churches began a series of discussions on COVID-19, its impact on our societies and our churches, the consequences for our witness, the sources for our resilience and hope and strength, the meaning of global solidarity, and the challenge of and the call for resistance. In my presentation at the start of these sessions, I pointed out that the church was not facing a single crisis, but instead a multiplicity of crises, not suddenly inflicted upon us, but long existent, not only ignored, but tolerated, yet inevitable, for they are deemed indispensable for the working of our societies in the grip of imperialism, new colonialism, and capitalism. So I appreciate Judge Griffen's exposure and analysis of this basic truth. I added something else in my first presentation 2 years ago. Colonized and oppressed people in countries such as South Africa and Africans in the United States have for almost 500 years endured pandemics of another kind, imperialist invasions of their countries, colonialist oppression, the theft of land and resources on a scale not equaled since the 17th century, genocide, epistemicide, which is the theft and diminishment, distortion, and manipulation of our histories, the almost complete annihilation of our cultures and religions, and the suppression of the stories of our communities. We have endured enslavement and racism and white supremacy and apartheid, its collective spawn. Now, on top of all of these comes the coronavirus, ushering in crises of fear, uncertainty, and a devastation not seen before. Our response, therefore, is not simply to a crisis, but to the whole complex of crises upon us today. Oxfam calls it a care crisis. The World Health Organization calls it a moral and political crisis. More than 30 years ago, in his prescient God for a Secular Society, German theologian Jürgen Moltmann spoke of a God crisis. What Moltmann means by this is that at the core of our multiple crises is our coldness towards the poor and the oppressed, and at the core of that is our coldness towards God. At the heart of our disdain for the poor is our disdain for God, and at the center of our carelessness towards the vulnerable is our disregard for God. This is how Moltmann, with deep insight as well as foresight, puts it. I quote him: "Our social and political frigidity towards the disadvantaged, the poor and the humiliated, is an expression of our frigidity towards God. The cynicism of modern political and economic manipulators is an expression of our contempt for God. We have lost God, and God has left us. And so we are bothered neither by the suffering of others which we have caused, nor by the debts we are leaving behind for coming generations." End quote. From a theological point of view, I think this is exactly right. From the lack of compassionate justice in the courts, to the dearth of leadership in politics, to the void left by the abandonment of what W.E. Du Bois called the politics of decency, integrity, honesty, courage, and virtue, from the brazen corruption at every level and the shameless greed of the capitalist classes to the incessant war on the poor and the vulnerable, this is precisely what we are facing. It is a God crisis. I contend that over against all of this, there seems to be only one force, a global revolution against injustice, imperialist violence and greed, and for life, global solidarity and human dignity we are at present witnessing. It is our only bulwark against the imperialist devastation of the world and the ruination of humanity. And here is where I express my appreciation for the connections Judge Griffen makes with Martin Luther King Jr.'s revolution of values. In that first contribution of mine to the World Communion of Reformed Churches and their COVID conversations, I urged the churches to join that worldwide revolution. And I too referenced Martin King's revolution of values. Almost immediately, someone from the European churches objected. King's revolution of values, she said to me, was a revolution of love. It had nothing to do with the revolutions that I was talking about. Dr. King's love revolution is the revolution that we should invite the churches to join. But this line of argument is demonstrably not correct. Dr. King himself spoke of the revolution of values in the same breath as he spoke of the revolution of the, quote, shirtless and barefoot peoples of the world rising up against oppression and subjugation. Second of all, this revolution was a revolution against what King called the triple evils besetting our world, namely racism, militarism, and capitalism. And so this revolution, in which King wanted us to be on the right side, was a very real revolution, overthrowing systems of oppression, exploitation, and enslavement, and thereby changing the world. But thirdly, over and over, Martin King spoke of love. But also over and over, he was at pains to point out that this love was not a sentimental notion that leaves systems of injustice intact, untouched, and untransformed. His love was a sacrificial, system-changing, world-transforming love. Hence, that reference to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Judge Griffen pointed out, and King's insistence that, quote, one day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed, so that men and women will not constantly be beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring, end quote. King then goes on to explain his revolution of values, which he then couples also with righteous indignation, followed by the rhythmic oratorical onslaught on capitalist greed, acquisitiveness, and destructiveness, and Western arrogance. This is not just. Even though in some ways they were worlds apart, somebody like Che Guevara understood this. I quote Che Guevara, "Let me say, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love," end quote. The love Martin King talks about is the revolutionary love that is rooted in the love for justice that is in the heart of God. It is God's love for justice that makes the struggles for justice and freedom holy ground, I have written elsewhere. A revolution without that love makes it merely a battleground. The revolution of values does not in any way whatsoever replace that global revolution. It rather becomes the heart of the revolution. Christians join that revolution, said M.M. Thomas of India, because they find themselves in the grip of an essential truth, namely that the struggle is about social justice and the creation, not just of a new world, but of a new humanity. Therefore, Thomas writes, Christians cannot but witness to it. And that witness, in my view, can only be made from within the heart of the struggle. Let me make a final point pertaining to the question of morality in political and religious leadership Judge Griffen also pointed us to. And my colleague, Professor Maimela, referred to this. 2 weeks ago or so, South Africans scientists announced that to the world that they had discovered a new variant of the coronavirus, which they now call Omicron. The reaction from the rich nations was immediate, blaming South Africa for giving birth to the new variant and punishing Southern Africa nations with travel bans. The General Secretary of the United Nations, as well as the head of the World Health Organization, immediately sounded the alarm. South Africa should not be blamed and punished, they said. The world should thank South Africa for their diligence, their responsibility, and their transparency. And that is exactly the point. One of South Africa's younger scientists, a member of the country's COVID-19 task force, spoke of a knee-jerk reaction which he also labeled racist. South Africa is not responsible for this new variant, our scientists maintain. South Africa has one of the most sophisticated and advanced infectious diseases infrastructure on the planet. We have capabilities developed through years of work with TB and with the AIDS pandemic and other diseases ravaging our continent. It is therefore no surprise that our medical system was the first in the world to identify this particular new variant. But ignoring all of that, the politicians of the rich world instantly and persistently spoke of a new COVID variant coming from South Africa. But this new COVID variant has been found in England, immediately putting the lie to Boris Johnson's propagandistic and racist prattle. It has also been found in New Zealand, in Brazil, France, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Canada, and other countries. South African scientists isolated, sequenced, and understood it first, and then had the responsibility, the solidarity, the accountability to immediately share this knowledge with the wider world. The racist label also sticks because the only countries hit by the travel ban are from the African continent. And that sense of responsibility, accountability, solidarity is precisely what these so-called world leaders lack. They do not have the honesty, the courage, or the responsibility, transparency, and accountability to acknowledge that the variant existed in their countries before it was identified in South Africa, and they do not have the decency to suppress their racism and give South Africa the credit that is her due. The racist knee-jerk position our young scientists spoke of is their first instinctive position. But that is how white supremacy works. The new variant simply underscores the fact that the World Organization and people of conscience across the world have endlessly been pointing out, as long as the vaccine apartheid continues, and the vast majority of the world's people who live in the poor global south countries are deprived of the vaccine or of the right to produce the vaccine for themselves, no one in the world is safe. And in this regard, the moral position is also the scientifically correct, politically responsible, and medically safe position. Yet, despite all of this, and despite the fact that they could have saved lives, racist pride, imperial power, and political stupidity prevent them from doing what is right. Wendell Griffen has a word for it. I quote him: the conduct of those politicians and religious leaders goes beyond being simple, scornful, and foolish. It is more than hypocritical, more than hubristic, and more than arrogant. It is self-righteous, self-serving, self-worshipping. Simply put, it is diabolical. He has another word, borrowed from that same of Game of Thrones Tyrion Lannister that my colleague has just quoted. We have had vicious kings and we've had idiot kings, but I do not know whether we've ever been cursed with a vicious idiot for a king. And so Wendell Griffen concludes, we have been cursed. The vicious idiots we have elected as kings are a curse upon the body politic of the world. They thrive in systems of violence and oppression, and in systems of concealment of violence and oppression. And to me, the choice is clear. Joining that world revolution that I spoke about is to create the possibilities for dismantling these systems of violence and concealment. And if we are not dismantling, we are conniving and reproducing. There is no middle ground on this issue because lives and death are at stake. Now, so stimulated by your lecture, Judge Griffen, here is my question. Over the years, Christian activists and prophetic voices have learned the difference between the institutional church and the prophetic church. We have been able to let that prophetic church be a transformative presence in our struggles despite resistance from the institutional church. The same is true from activism in the political sphere. We have been able to circumvent corrupt political systems and structures and to build what we then call extra-parliamentary movements of the people, subverting official politics, mobilizing the people, and gaining huge and even decisive victories. But what about an immoral, lawless legal system, such as the ones we are facing in just about every country in the world today? How can we reclaim integrity and morality for the law and for our legal systems? Can we have righteous activism for the redemption of the law without falling into some kind of extremist right-wing vigilantism? Because that is sometimes the only obstacle, or not obstacle, the alternative that people see. Either you abide by the law, or you say, because justice is not found in the courts, we take it to the streets, we do whatever we like. See Rittenhouse in the United States, see the lynchings in the United States, and see what is happening in our country today. And so that is my question. Can we do what we did in the churches and what we did in politics? Can we also do that in terms of our legal systems? I thank you so much for your wonderful lecture, of which I have learned so very much again today. Thank you, Professor Schoeman.
Thank you very much, Professor Busak, also for those insightful comments and also for emphasizing that we should be striving here for a new humanity. And I guess that's also the one thing that baffles me. The whole world knows that we have to work together to overcome this pandemic, and yet we just cannot seem to be getting it right. So we are now into the question and answer session. So I think maybe I'm going to ask Judge Griffen if he would like to respond to Professor Busak's question right at the end, whether you would like to respond to that first. Maybe Professor Busak, if you would like to paraphrase the question for the benefit of our audience, please.
Thank you, Professor Schoeman. My question was that we have, in the struggle in South Africa and elsewhere in the world, we have discovered that if you depend on the institutional church with its structures and its rules and its regulations and its compromises with the ruling classes of the world, that we will not get anywhere. But we then talked about a prophetic church, which we use as a model to join the struggle, despite sometimes resistance from the institutionalized churches. Politically, we have been able to say the political systems are so corrupt, politicians are so corrupt, there is nothing good or hopeful to expect from them. So we formed extra-parliamentary internal opposition, and we fought the official politics, like in South Africa, we fought apartheid through the extra-parliamentary mobilization of people through the United Democratic Front, and we gave people hope, we gave people strength, and we actually enjoyed huge victories. We brought apartheid down. My question is, you can do that with the church, it seems. You can do that with politics, it seems. Is that at all possible to look at a legal system that is corrupting, that would let a murderer like Rittenhouse go free without a single conviction, and not just him, one after the other, after the other, after the other. And you have here courts that will make a ruling on the same issue, but when it pertains to somebody in power, the courts make a different judgment. If it pertains to somebody else, not so powerful, then the courts make a totally different, but on the same kind of issue. That kind of corruption, how does one circumvent that and create an activism that could transform our justice system without saying what some people say, if I cannot find justice in the court, my only recourse is then to go out and be a vigilante and sort of bring justice for myself through my own goals. That is the death of good law. It's the death of good order. It's the death of civilized society, if we go that route. But my question is it at all possible to do that without doing what I just described now?
I thank you, Professor Buzak, for the question, and I think that it calls upon us to embrace what you have correctly framed as, and as M.M. Thomas has called, this call for a new humanity. We really are seeing in stark relief in both the racist approach to the of the travel bans against South Africa, we're seeing in stark relief the nefarious hoarding of vaccines in the affluent societies, the rush to send boosters to affluent societies when we have not shared the first vaccines and have kept vaccine technology and vaccine availability from other societies. We have seen a form of, and I call it diabolical, we have seen a form of inhumanity that in my lifetime has not been seen. And so we are really between several very painful options. Number one, there's the question of can we have confidence in law if law has no morality?
Yeah.
If law has become basically the means by which conventional immorality has become validated, can we have a system of community in the world where it seems that the people of the world, in the face of a global pandemic, are stuck in what seems to be a time warp? The racist, capitalist, imperialist tendencies of the previous centuries have seemingly become even more animated in the face of this pandemic. I was aghast at the response of the travel bans. I was aghast with travel bans. I believe we can, to answer your question, I believe we can, but I think we have to admit some limitations. Number one, we cannot expect to heal the world with the emperor's tools. The empire does not supply the tools of its own correction. We must assume for ourselves and accept that the empire is both morally and socially, culturally, it is spiritually incompetent in this situation. And those of us who believe in justice, who believe in community, who believe that truth does not have a national border to it, that the West does not have the be-all and end-all of intellect or knowledge or virtue, have to say a pox on the notion that we are going to stop the Omicron variant with a travel ban. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. The travel ban the Omicron variant didn't begin in South Africa. The Omicron variant began with COVID, and COVID is all over the world. And that's basic knowledge. But we have to say enough of this foolishness and say to the capitalists of the world, to the imperialists of the world who want to say to us, trust us to fix this. No, we no longer have reason to trust you. And this latest act in regard to the Omicron variant is the latest reason why we should not trust you, that we should have an extra governmental, we should have an extra territorial, we should have an extra legal approach to this, because the traditional ways of doing this, the traditional systems of doing this, the traditional mindset not only does not work, it is working more harm. It is replicating the harms that we've already suffered from, and we can no longer afford to be patient while you repeat the harms while the world dies. And so I believe, yes, we can do it. The question is, do we have the courage? Do we have the discernment? Do we have the anger to do it? And I think it's important that we do that. And I intentionally use the word anger because, quite frankly, we should be angry. I am angry with you about the response to the Omicron virus, because I am angry that people are blaming the same racism that blamed COVID on China. Okay? Where Trump called it the China virus, is now blaming the Omicron variant on South Africa. It was racist when Trump did it. It's racist now. The only difference is that the racism is targeting South Africa. We cannot trust this. We're going to have to look at the WHO and find some other allies and some other resources, but people of goodwill and good intellect can do this. I think we can.
Judge Griffen, and thank you also for that question, Professor Busak. I now want to turn to Professor Pillay, and I want to address this question to you. Professor Busak referred to the God for a secular world, and I want to hear from you. We have religious societies, we have secular societies. How important is moral fiber? How do we build that across all these different societies? Should the church take a lead in this? What are your views as the Dean of the Faculty of Theology and Religion?
Well, I think the moral fiber transcends any particular experience or system. At least it ought to. Moral aspects should be within the fabric of society. It should be ingrained in the very bones of our formation. It ought to be in every person. It ought to be in every organization. It has to be central to our existence as life and in life itself. So I would say, yes, it should be a normative experience. But the problem today is that people tend to think of moral issues on different levels. And we have traditional sense of moral thinking, we have conventional senses of moral thinking, and today we have the new morality. And these transcending dimensions confuses how people think about morality. And so morality becomes subjective, relative to one's experience and situation. And so it tends to derive different connotations to different communities. I think therein lies the problem. I think Dr. Busak actually made it very clear, though, that when he tried to set the whole aspect of moral understanding in the heart of God. Now, I do know that not everybody believes in God, or not everybody has the same experience of God, or the same value assigned to God. But I think in terms of understanding the place where it is situated and based, if we understand it as being part of the art of God and the experience of God living in the world today, then no matter from what dimension you look and relate to the issue of morality, you would have righteous living, good living, the concept of, as Judge Griffen spoke about, care and compassion for the other. And I think that has all to do with moral fiber, moral doing, and moral being. So I think moral issues are important. And the question is, how do we value them? How do we see them? And the question is, from whose perspective?
Yeah.
Any comments from the other panel members on that as well?
I would echo what Dean Pillay said about recognizing that this is not so much institutional, either from the perspective of religion or law. It really calls for us to recognize our common humanity. COVID does not care whether one is a Baptist or an agnostic or an atheist.
No.
COVID really does not care whether one is a capitalist or a socialist or a Marxist. COVID does not care whether one lives on one side of the globe or the other side of the globe. Unfortunately, the institutions of our world pretend that they are trans-COVID, that they are COVID exempt. And unfortunately, when we deal with institutional law or institutional religion, we are stuck in the mindset of people who believe that their institutions should define the way they approach responses to something that is not institutionally bound. I really believe that the prophetic response is organic.
Yeah.
It is organic. It is not institutional.
Yeah.
Professor Maimela, I believe, touched on it when he talked about the truths that come from the ancestral traditions, our cultural traditions that not only predate institutions, but transcend institutions. And quite frankly, are probably more reliable than the institutional things that are responsible for so many of our woes.
Yeah.
And I think that what our hope can be found is if we will respect that organic prophetic strand in all people.
Yeah.
And from that, say to us as a people, we are facing a common threat, COVID. And let us not trust the existing institutions to deal with it because we know how they have dealt with things. They deal with things through their capitalism, and their racism, through materialism, but through their institutions. Let's deal with this through our humanity. And how can we work together? I believe the WHO has been trying to get us to do that since this thing started. Unfortunately, the world leaders have behaved as if this was something that could be institutionalized, and I don't think that's happening. If everybody is hungry, then we should be trying to figure out how to feed everybody. If everybody is sick, we should be trying to heal everybody. If everybody is subject to the infection, we should be trying to protect everybody. We should not be trying to figure out how to build capsules and silos by which some people are protected and the rest of people are consigned to a hellish existence of wondering when or how long it will be before the scourge comes to them.
I would like to ask you a question as well, Professor Maimela, but I see you've been making notes, so would you like to respond as well to this one?
No, I was just wanted to add that the role of civil society is also important in the fight against this pandemic and future pandemics itself. I've just mentioned briefly the role of the media, very fundamental. Most importantly, the role of the church. I think as a people, we need to understand now the fundamental basics of the church, because the church is is a space of trust, among other things. And I believe some of the drive towards the vaccine hesitancy and the stigma around vaccination, governments should rely squarely to churches, because in most instances, people on the ground have full access to churches, and the role of church leaders is very fundamental as well in fighting this scourge. So it should be a form of a collaborative effort where members of the community, people on the ground, take an active lead, among other things, in raising awareness and education about the scourge and the importance of vaccination, among other things. It shouldn't be something that only resides in the South African context, in the union buildings, when the president is coming to address the nation, but it should be something that is experienced on a daily basis on people on the ground, and most importantly, to ensure that vaccines are accessible for all people and sundry, with the whole aim of ensuring that people are empowered, because we have seen it with the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And yesterday, as we were celebrating the World AIDS Day, among other things, we still saw that there's still stigma that is still perpetuating around the HIV and AIDS pandemic. But through awareness and education, things have started to build up and to become better, because people do better when they're empowered. So I believe also going back to those basics as we fight the scourge of COVID-19 will truly help and save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maimela. Before I go on to the next question, I've seen Professor Busak listening very attentively, and I would just like to ask him if he would like to add something. While we are now in this fight, how do we go forward? How do we do this?
Thank you, Professor Skuman. Let me jump in where Professor Maimela made note of the fact how important the churches are. Of course, I cannot agree with you more on that question. We have a bit of a dilemma, though. There are many of our churches in South Africa, especially those churches that are under the strong influence of white American right-wing evangelical religiosity. Where they get their money from, where they get their theology from, where they get their ways of reading scripture from, where they get their preaching from. That is a great source of resistance to vaccination. Now, the American situation has everything to do with the fact that the white evangelical right finds themselves or see themselves as an army of God fighting what they call the Democrats. Now, that's their fight. What they do, though, so everything that their government does, for them, they turn that into a faith issue, even though that is not at all what it is. The problem is that theology, they then transplant over here, and we have too many churches who take that. Some of my most disturbing conversations is with some of my colleagues in these churches who have all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories about vaccination, who every time the president speaks and talks about vaccination or talks about COVID, they think he has become an instrument of the devil. And so we have a fight within the churches. And it's simply what I'm trying to say is those of us who know how important the churches are in the lives of our people, you are correct. It is in many ways one of the most trusted spaces. Politics are no longer trusted. Parliament is no longer trusted. The courts are not really very much trusted. The church still have that. And we must make sure that the church, while it is a trusted space, must become a safe space for women, for girl children, a safe space for people who are vulnerable to what the vaccine, what COVID and the virus can do to them. And so, and you're right, we must work together with the media and everything. I'm more and more convinced that COVID might be one of those stimulants that can bring our societies together in ways that we have not been together and of one mind in South Africa in the last 25 years. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. And so the work within the churches has to happen both within the churches and with the churches and the rest of civil society, and with the churches and with government on this particular issue.
Thank you very much, Professor Busak. I now have to ask this question to the Deputy Dean of Law, also the Dean of Theology. I'm not going to answer that tonight. But at the moment, we have to navigate this very difficult situation where we see the cases rising, we see other universities implementing mandatory vaccination policies. We know we all want our students back on campus. How do you navigate within this sea of uncertainty? And I'm going to ask my Deputy Dean to reply to that first. Just very briefly, how do you make decisions, in this age of severe uncertainty?
In the university context, I think more empowerment on the side of our students in accelerating awareness and the importance of vaccination, and most importantly, to conscientize our students about what is a university. Because our students, as well as staff in most instances, we enter into universities as a space of trade, and students come in as there to obtain their degrees and continue with life. So it's an opportunity for us to start to inculcate the basics of and the fundamentals of what is university as a space of knowledge generation, creating new opportunities, among other things. So I believe we need to accelerate more, particularly with regards to COVID-19 awareness in terms of vaccination, and also to exploit and expose to our students the dangers of not being vaccinated as they come into the campus space, the effect which will not only affect them, but also the communities which they come from. So I do not subscribe to the COVID-19 vaccines to be made mandatory. I am waiting with anxious breath for the 2022 academic year for those universities who have made that moratorium, because it's easy on paper as to make these regulations and pass them, but when it comes to implementation, there'll be a bit of a challenge. And also bearing in mind also the socioeconomic aspects of our country, the diversity of our country, among other things. So those are some of the things I look forward to in also engaging and debating in this space as to whether COVID-19 vaccines should be made mandatory or not. But to answer your question in a nutshell is we need to go back to basics, as Professor Busak has alluded, that this is an opportunity of renewal as well as holding hands together, both with our students and the community at large in taking this fight forward. So the university, I believe, should accelerate more awareness and education towards COVID-19 vaccination. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maimela. Professor Pillay.
Too much of false information, too much of distortion of facts that needs to be dealt with quite seriously. Now, whilst this debate is a big debate in terms of whether we make it compulsory or not as far as the vaccines are concerned, I think it's also important to understand that it is not just a matter of protecting myself alone, but also of protecting the other. And if we look at that big picture, then it must say to us that we each have a responsibility to make a safe community and to protect the other person. So the debate can actually bring us to a point of saying, yes, we should not force anyone to take the vaccine, whether it is for personal reasons or religious reasons. They have the right to make the choice and decision. But in terms of making the decision, one needs to take a holistic picture, and one needs to understand the broad framework of implications. To create and sustain community, to protect lives, is a responsibility for every single person. So getting back to the issue of truthful communication, for example, there have been some strong tele-evangelists who have been propagating the anti-vaccine imperative, that we should not take that. But if you go and just recently, even as recent as yesterday, one strong particular advocate of that same position died of COVID-19 related sicknesses. And he says to the community of people, do not take this vaccine because God will protect you. Now, in my opinion, that is total false communication. That is irresponsible communication. In fact, I will go to the deepest extent of saying that is immoral communication coming from somebody who professes to proclaim the word of God. Now, that person dies. Well, of course, we can argue it is within the time of God. But had that person taken the vaccine for himself, for example, what could have been? But how many people are following the lead of this televangelist? And how many people will lose their lives? And how many people will actually be a threat to the lives of other people because they simply say, faith forces me to trust God. But as I often say in the church community and beyond, faith does not mean that we must be foolish. So therefore, I think it is important for us to understand that when we're talking about the mandatory, the compulsory, or whether we should make it mandatory, the debate must be beyond ourselves. The debate must take us into the protection and the care and the concern of our neighbor. And if that is the imperative, then I need to give a second thought to this discussion and in terms of the position one takes. So yes, of course, ultimately the choice is the person's. But in making that decision, it should also be what I will argue for, a communal ethic.
Thank you, Professor Pillay. So we are slowly running out of time. And before I give Professor Pillay an opportunity to close the proceedings, I'm going to ask Professor Busak and Judge Griffen for a 1-minute last word. And I would like Professor Busak first to go and to tell us what he would say from Africa to the world. And then after that, I'm going to ask Judge Griffen to tell us what the world is saying to Africa. So Professor Busak, if you can go first, each has 1 minute.
1 minute. Thank you. I would say two things. I would say a word to the world first, that from Africa. And this is that if you do not understand at this critical juncture of our human history in the situation in which we find ourselves now, that there must be such a thing as an embedded, tangible solidarity of all of humanity, so that we can see how we can help one another in all of this, then I'm afraid we will be missing an opportunity which Christians would call a kairos moment and a God-given moment to bring our world together in ways that we haven't been able to do before. This crisis, if that doesn't do it, I don't know what will. Second thing is I want to say to Africa, we must stop listening to the West as if they have all the wisdom in the world. I talked the other day in another webinar with the World Council of Churches, and we talked about the World Trade Organization, where the debate about whether the intellectual property rights must be relaxed so that we in the global south can also produce the vaccine. Now, the World Trade Organization is the organization where these great multinational companies, the pharmaceutical companies, have the most say. They make the rules and they rule the roost. So my conclusion was, I must say to Africa, you don't have to go and knock at that door. We have the know-how, we have the facilities, we have the people. We must simply say to them, you can do whatever you will, our people's lives, and say, we will vaccinate and we will find a way to produce the vaccines. And we will challenge you on that. If you take us to your courts, then you must take us to your courts. But for us, the lives of our people are now paramount. And we are not going to ask permission from the UK or from the United States or from their pharmaceutical companies whether we have the right to save the lives of our people and to protect the lives of our children. That's what I would say.
you, Professor Busak, and you also have 1 minute, Judge Griffen, please. What are you saying to Africa?
I will say to Africa that the world is not safe if Africa is not safe. And Africa is not safe if the world is not safe. And the world and Africa must save the world and Africa. But Africa cannot afford to allow the world's West to dictate how it is saved. We have seen far too much evidence that we cannot trust the West. We cannot trust the West to protect Africa. We can trust Africa to know how it needs to protect itself and to work with the rest of the world on protecting Africa and the world. And I would agree with Professor Busak. Do not trust the West's systems, be they legal, commercial, religious, or otherwise, on how this thing works out.
That's right.
Think outside the box. If you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten, and what we've always gotten is injustice and oppression. And we don't want to do this. I said in my first lecture, no place will be safe unless the world is safe. And the world will not be safe if any place in the world is unsafe. Unlike AIDS and HIV, we're dealing with a respiratory virus. We transmit AIDS and HIV by exchanging body fluids. We transmit COVID by breathing. And quite frankly, we don't have an option about breathing.
Thank you, Judge Griffen. And now it's over to you, Professor Pillay, to please conclude the proceedings for us.
Thank you very much, Professor Skuban. Especially thank you to you for moderating this particular session. It's amazing how quick time has flown with regards to these 2 hours. And I think it's important because you've been dealing with some very relevant issues. Judge Griffen, I do want to say a very personal thank you on behalf of myself and the faculty, and behalf of Faculty of Law as well, for your availability for these lectures, the first one and the second one, and for the way in which you have weaved so strategically and spontaneously aspects of law and theology into the conversation. And as you reminded us about each of our particular perspectives and areas of interest and academic discipline, if you wish, and how these things are brought together in understanding the realities of life, and especially in this particular debates with regards to the COVID situation. And of course, the skills that you have in these 2 different areas speaks for itself. And you've done such great justice in speaking to us about legal perspectives and combined with religious perspectives. We will remember these for a long time. This is very pertinent right now, and all these debates with regards to COVID-19, legal and religious perspectives are so important for us to put before ourselves in terms of continued conversations. And I certainly think that these conversations will continue. So thank you so much for your input and for your preparation and for your availability. We truly, truly appreciate all the contributions that you have made, not only today, but even before. I want to say thank you to the respondents. Professor Maimela, thank you so much for highlighting certain key aspects of Judge Griffen's lecture to us today, and for the way in which you contextualize that, not only in the South African context, but more appropriately into the African context at large. And certainly you have drawn the connections and outlined certain very important points for critical reflection. And also like the points that you have made with regards to church. And I think they've shown us the need and the call for even religious bodies to be self-critical. Professor Busak, thank you so much for again this combination of more deeply giving insight into the religious perspective and showing us how God, in terms of how we really should understand the nature of God, should be the pervading factor in terms of how we interpret, understand, and analyze experiences in life. And as you have so rightly shown us, is that God is a God of justice, a God who favors the poor and the needy and the suffering in the world. And I thought, as he was drawing with regards to the reference to the revolution of values and spoke about the person that actually was critical about your comment on that, and speaking about the revolution of love, I think you quite wonderfully put it together in terms of saying that love and justice go together. In fact, they are necessary bedfellows, in my opinion. And I think you summed it up beautifully in saying why that is the case. You said because God's love for justice is revolutionary itself. So thank you for that deep religious perspective and insight into this conversation as well. So thank you to all of you for your participation. Thank you to the people who have assisted us with the technicalities of this presentation. And thank you to those who have been viewing with us and listening to the debates. We sincerely thank you for your time that you've given to us today and tonight or this morning for those in the US. We trust that all that we have shared with you will continue to linger in your thoughts, will continue to provide more stimulating debates, but more particularly help you as you make personal decisions about the experiences we currently experience in this life. So we thank you very much. And I want to say thank you to the Faculty of Law for the participation and for the wonderful collaboration that our Faculty of Theology and Religion has had with law in this particular webinars and conversations. Thank you to all of you. Go well, keep well. God bless.
God bless.